B-17 doesn't survive when it's cut in half at 24,000 feet. But when German flak tore one fortress apart, the tail gunner didn't fall silent. He kept shooting as the wreckage dropped through the sky. The Luftwaffe circled to confirm the kill and discovered something that refused to stop firing all the way down. If this story sounds impossible, stay with us. What happened next defied physics, training, and every rule of air combat in World War II. A B-17 flying fortress was never supposed to come apart in the air and leave anyone alive. At 24,000 feet, survival was already a fragile illusion. The temperature outside dropped below -40. Oxygen was thin enough to slow reflexes and dull judgment. Any exposed skin froze within minutes. Even inside the aircraft, men worked in bulky heated suits, breathing through masks, their movements stiff and slow. War at that altitude was mechanical, unforgiving, and absolute. German fighter pilots understood this better than anyone. By late 1943, they had learned exactly how to kill a B-17. Not head-on, not from the sides, but from directly behind. The tail was the bomber's weakest angle and its most isolated position. One man, 2 machine guns, 40 feet of aluminum, an empty fuselage separating him from the rest of the crew. No quick escape. No one to replace him if he was hit. If the tail gunner went silent, the bomber was already dead. Every Luftwaffe pilot knew it. That was why damaged bombers never survived the return flight. A B-17 flying alone was not unlucky. It was condemned. Once a fortress fell out of formation, its overlapping defensive fire vanished. The bomber became a slow, predictable target, struggling to hold altitude, engines straining, airspeed bleeding away. German pilots watched for these stragglers with patience. They didn't rush the kill. They circled, lined up, and dismantled the aircraft piece by piece. First the engines, then the gunners, then the fuselage. At 24,000 feet, even a single direct hit from a 20mm cannon could shear through aluminum like paper. Control cables snapped, structural ribs bent, metal screamed under stress. When enough damage accumulated, the aircraft did not explode. It failed, quietly, catastrophically. That failure usually ended in one of two ways. Either the bomber lost control and spiraled into the ground, or the crew bailed out and trusted their parachutes to do the rest. There was no third option. A parachute was the last promise of survival. Without it, a fall from that altitude was not a gamble. It was a sentence. Human terminal velocity offered no mercy, and metal wreckage fell faster still. No man could survive 4 miles of free fall. No training, no courage, no strength changed that equation, which made what happened next impossible. German flak tore through the bomber's structure with surgical precision. The aircraft shuddered, twisted, and then came apart. Not gradually, not cleanly. The fuselage split, and the fortress ceased to be an airplane. By every rule of physics, aviation, and experience, the fight should have ended there. The crew should have vanished with the wreckage. The guns should have gone silent. The sky should have been empty again. Instead, as the remains of the B-17 began to fall from 24,000 feet, German pilots circling the debris saw something that made no sense at all. Gunfire. Tracer rounds streaked upward from a section of wreckage that should not have existed, fired by a man who should not have been alive, from a position that should have been the first to die. A severed tail section, dropping through the sky, was still shooting. The tail gunner's position was never designed for survival. It existed for one purpose only: to delay death long enough for the rest of the aircraft to stay intact. At the very back of a B-17, the tail gunner sat alone, sealed inside a narrow metal compartment no wider than his shoulders. There was no armor thick enough to stop cannon fire, only thin aluminum skin and a steel chest plate meant to absorb fragments. His world consisted of 2 machine guns, a ring sight, and whatever appeared in the empty sky behind him. From that angle, German fighters came in fast and low, rising into view at the last possible second. There was no warning, no maneuver to dodge. If the tail gunner reacted too late, the aircraft paid the price. This isolation was not an accident. It was the price of protection. By design, the tail gunner had no direct line of sight to the cockpit, no clear idea of what damage the bomber had already taken, no way of knowing if engines were failing, if fuel was leaking, if control surfaces were still responding. He learned the fate of the aircraft through vibration, through sound, through the sudden absence of voices on the intercom. When the intercom went quiet, it meant only one thing. Something forward had gone terribly wrong. By the time the bomber began to fall behind its formation, the situation was already unrecoverable. Formation flying was the only thing that kept B-17 crews alive. Hundreds of bombers flying in tight defensive boxes created overlapping fields of fire that no single fighter could penetrate safely. Once a bomber slipped out of that shield, it became visible in a way that was almost magnetic. German pilots did not attack immediately. They waited. They climbed above. They dropped below. They measured speed and angle. They identified which guns were still firing and which had fallen silent. The kill was methodical, not frantic. Inside the tail, the gunner felt every hit before he understood what it meant. A dull thump as flak punched through the fuselage. A violent shudder as a control surface failed. The sudden yaw as an engine lost power. Then the impacts came faster, closer, more deliberate. 20-millimeter cannon rounds were not meant to wound. They were meant to destroy. When they struck, they detonated inside the aircraft, tearing open metal, snapping cables, spraying fragments through confined spaces. A single hit could end a position instantly. Somewhere forward, guns stopped firing. Then another. Then another. The tail gunner did not need confirmation. Silence told him enough. He kept firing because stopping would not save him. He fired because, as long as the guns were active, the aircraft still existed as a threat. And as long as the bomber was a threat, the enemy had to respect it. That fragile balance shattered in seconds. A violent impact ripped through the structure above him. The vibration changed pitch, turning from steady strain into uncontrolled oscillation. The aircraft no longer behaved like a machine in flight. It behaved like something coming apart. Control cables snapped loose and whipped through the compartment. Air tore in through new openings, dragging cold and debris with it. The bomber twisted hard enough to throw the gunner against his restraints. Then came the sound no aircrew ever forgot. The scream of aluminum failing under load. The fuselage did not bend. It tore. Forward of the tail, the aircraft separated. The weight of engines, wings, cockpit, and crew pulled away in an instant, vanishing downward in a blur of metal and fire. What remained was not an airplane, not even wreckage in the usual sense. It was a fragment. A hollow section of tail, severed cleanly from the rest of the bomber, carrying one man who no longer had an aircraft, no longer had a crew, and no longer had any possibility of escape. The fall had begun. By every rule that governed air combat, gravity, and survival, the guns should have stopped firing at that moment. They did not. What fell from the sky was no longer an aircraft. It had no wings, no engines, no pilot, no control surfaces connected to anything that could be flown. By every standard definition, it was debris. But debris does not behave the same way when it falls. The severed tail section of a B-17 was a violent, unbalanced mass of metal, steel framing, ammunition, and gun mounts. As it dropped away from the main fuselage, it did not fall cleanly. It tumbled. It yawed. It spun end over end, dragged by torn edges and jagged surfaces that caught the air unevenly. Inside that chaos, the tail gunner was still alive. The forces were brutal. Gravity pulled downward while rotational momentum slammed his body sideways, then upward, then violently back into the steel chest plate. Blood sprayed across the interior as shrapnel wounds reopened. The cold rushed in through the ruptured fuselage, stripping away any remaining warmth in seconds. The noise was deafening. Wind screamed through the open structure like a living thing. This was not freefall. It was worse. Freefall followed predictable rules. This did not. The stabilizers at the rear of the tail section, designed to keep a bomber steady in controlled flight, now worked against gravity in unintended ways. As air rushed past them, they created drag. Not enough to stop the descent, not enough to make it safe, but enough to slow it, to stretch seconds into something longer. Time, under these conditions, became distorted. German fighters circled the falling wreckage, cautious and curious. They had watched the bomber break apart. They had seen the kill. Standard procedure now was confirmation. Pilots descended slightly, lining up for a closer look, ensuring the threat was truly gone before breaking off. That was when they realized the mistake. Tracer fire erupted from the spinning tail section. The shooting was wild, uncontrolled, dragged across the sky by rotation and gravity, but it was still lethal. The gunner was no longer aiming in the traditional sense. He could not track a target. He could not stabilize his sight. All he could do was fire into the space where the fighters had chosen to fly. And that was enough. German pilots scattered instinctively. No one trained for this. No combat manual described a man firing from falling wreckage. Attacking a crippled aircraft was one thing. Closing on a tumbling, unpredictable mass that was still shooting back was something else entirely. Every second they hesitated mattered. The continued gunfire changed the dynamics of the fall. As long as enemy fighters stayed at a distance, they could not finish the kill in the air. They could not strafe the wreckage. They could not fire into the compartment and end it immediately. The tail section kept falling. But it was falling alone. Inside, the gunner did not know how far he had dropped. The altimeter was shattered. The ground was invisible through spinning metal and rushing air. There was no sense of direction, only motion and impact and noise. He fired because it was the only action left to him. He fired because stopping meant nothing improved. He fired because as long as the guns were active, he still existed as a threat. Below him, the ground was rising fast. Fields, forests, roads, shapes that grew clearer with every second the stabilizers bought him. The rotation began to slow, not by design, not by control, but by resistance. Drag fought gravity just enough to change the fall from vertical to something closer to a glide. Not safe, not survivable, but no longer instant death. The wreckage struck the tops of trees at tremendous speed. Branches snapped, metal tore away. The vertical stabilizer caught, twisted, and ripped free, shedding energy violently as the tail section cartwheeled through the forest canopy. The impact was catastrophic. And still, against every reasonable expectation, it was not the end. When the wreckage finally came to rest, silence replaced the violence with unsettling speed. No engines, no gunfire, no wind tearing through broken metal, just the sound of cooling aluminum and a forest that had witnessed something it was never meant to see. The tail section lay shattered among frozen trees, twisted and torn, unrecognizable as part of a bomber that had once flown at 24,000 feet. Inside it, the gunner was still alive. Barely. Both arms were broken in multiple places, bones driven through flesh at unnatural angles. Ribs had collapsed inward, turning every breath into a blade of pain. A section of his skull had been torn open by impact, leaving part of his brain exposed to the freezing air. Blood pooled beneath him and began to darken as it cooled. Survival, at this point, was no longer a miracle. It was a liability. He was deep inside enemy territory. German civilians and soldiers would arrive soon. He had just taken part in a bombing raid over one of the Reich's most heavily defended industrial cities. To anyone who found him, he was not a wounded man. He was an enemy airman responsible for destruction and death. If he remained where he was, hypothermia would finish what gravity had failed to do. If he moved, the pain threatened to overwhelm him. But still, instinct took over. He dragged himself out of the wreckage, inch by inch, leaving a trail in the snow behind him. It did not take long for voices to appear. German soldiers reached the crash site cautiously, rifles raised, expecting to find a corpse. Instead, they found a man who should not have been alive. They stared, not in fear, but in disbelief. An American airman, broken beyond recognition, lying in the snow beneath a fallen section of his own aircraft. They did not rush to help him. Orders were clear. Downed aircrew were to be captured if possible, interrogated if useful. Medical treatment was a luxury reserved for those likely to survive. This man, bleeding, barely conscious, with catastrophic injuries, did not qualify. They searched him roughly, ignoring his screams as they moved shattered limbs. They found his identification. They found the ruined parachute. They found proof of what he was. Then they left him where he lay while they examined the wreckage. Hours passed. Eventually, he was loaded onto a wooden cart. No stretcher, no blankets, no morphine. The cart rattled over frozen roads toward a German military facility, each jolt sending fresh waves of agony through his body. Blood froze along the edges of his wounds. Consciousness faded and returned in fragments. At the facility, he was placed on a concrete floor and largely forgotten. No surgeon came. No medic knelt beside him. No one expected him to last the night. For 2 days, infection crept through his injuries unchecked. The exposed tissue swelled. Fever set in. His arms darkened as circulation failed. Without intervention, death was no longer a question of if, only when. By every logic that governed war, medicine, and probability, this was where the story should have ended. He had survived the impossible fall. Now he was dying from being alive. And then, against all expectation, someone decided he was worth saving. The building that served as a hospital barely deserved the name. It was a converted structure pressed into service by necessity, not design. Concrete floors, poor lighting, equipment scavenged from other facilities. Wounded men lay where space allowed, sorted not by rank or nationality, but by likelihood of survival. Those who might live received attention. Those who would not were left alone. By any rational standard, the American airman belonged in the second group. His injuries were catastrophic. Infection had already set in. Without antibiotics, without proper surgery, without sterile conditions, survival was nearly impossible. German doctors were overwhelmed with their own wounded, operating under shortages that worsened by the week. An enemy airman with shattered limbs and exposed brain tissue was not a priority. He was an inevitability. But within that hospital was an exception. 2 physicians, prisoners themselves, had been captured earlier in the war and forced into service. They were trained doctors, not soldiers, men whose professional instincts had survived captivity and coercion. When they examined the American, they did not see an enemy. They saw a body still fighting to stay alive. They understood the reality. They had no proper anesthesia, no modern surgical tools, no guarantee that intervention would succeed. They also understood something else. Doing nothing guaranteed death. The decision was made quietly, without orders, without ceremony. They would operate. The surgery lasted for hours. Bone fragments were removed by hand. Broken limbs were aligned and stabilized with metal pins and wire improvised from what little was available. Infected tissue was cut away to slow the spread that threatened his blood. The exposed portion of his skull was cleaned and covered as best as possible. A crude metal plate fitted into place to protect what remained beneath. Pain was constant. Consciousness came and went. There was no escape from awareness, only moments where it dulled enough to endure. When the work was finished, the doctors did not celebrate. They offered no reassurance. They told him the truth. The next few days would decide everything. If the infection slowed, he might live. If fever consumed him, he would not. There was nothing more they could do. The nights that followed were worse than the fall. His temperature climbed dangerously high. His body shook uncontrollably, trapped between chills and burning heat. Delirium set in. He spoke to people who were no longer alive. He relived the sound of tearing metal, the sensation of falling, the endless noise of wind and gunfire. The doctors stayed when they could. They changed bandages. They pressed cold cloths against his forehead. They forced water into his mouth when he could no longer lift his head. They had no medicine powerful enough to fight the infection. All they could offer was persistence. On the third morning, the fever broke. It did not vanish. It retreated. His breathing steadied. The swelling around his wounds slowed. The signs were subtle, easy to miss, but unmistakable to trained eyes. His body was no longer losing ground. It was resisting. Against logic, against circumstance, against the limits of the tools used to save him, he had survived again. The fall had failed to kill him. The crash had failed to kill him. Infection had failed to kill him. But survival carried a cost. Once he could be moved, once he was stable enough to remain conscious, his status changed. He was no longer a dying man in a hospital. He was a prisoner of war, and that meant the next chapter would last far longer than any fall through the sky. Recovery did not mean freedom. It meant transfer. Once the doctors declared him stable enough to travel, the machinery of war reclaimed him. Paperwork replaced compassion. Orders replaced judgment. He was processed, photographed, identified, and moved into the system, designed to hold men until the war decided what to do with them. He was sent to a prisoner of war camp built specifically for captured Allied airmen. Behind barbed wire and guard towers, survival took on a new meaning. Days were measured in rations. Weeks were marked by weight loss. Months passed in routines meant to preserve order, not health. The camp offered shelter from bullets, but little protection from hunger, cold, and disease. Food arrived inconsistently: thin soup, black bread, occasionally potatoes or turnips. Red Cross parcels, when they came, were shared, stretched, and rationed with precision born of desperation. Men lost weight steadily. Muscles weakened. Old wounds ached constantly, especially in the cold. His injuries never fully healed. The metal plate in his skull brought headaches that pulsed with weather changes. His arms, set and healed without modern care, never regained their former strength. Pain became a background presence, something to be managed rather than defeated. Transfers followed. As Allied forces advanced and German lines shifted, prisoners were moved again and again. Cattle cars replaced barracks. Dozens of men packed into dark metal spaces with no room to sit, no sanitation, and little air. Journeys lasted days. Some men collapsed and never stood again when the doors finally opened. Then came the ship. Hundreds of prisoners were forced below deck into a cargo hold never meant for human beings. Darkness swallowed everything. Air barely moved. A single bucket served as a latrine. The crossing lasted days, and men died where they lay, bodies left among the living because there was nowhere else to put them. Madness set in quickly. When the hatch finally opened, those who emerged looked less like soldiers and more like survivors of something ancient and cruel. Weight had vanished. Eyes struggled with light. Strength came back slowly, if at all. The war dragged on. So did captivity. By early 1945, Germany was collapsing under pressure from both east and west. Guards grew nervous. Supplies thinned further. Rumors spread faster than food ever had. Liberation felt close, but distance did not shorten suffering. Then the order came. All prisoners would march west on foot. The temperature dropped far below freezing. Many men had no winter clothing, no gloves, no proper boots. They were weak from starvation and illness, expected to walk day after day through snow and ice. Those who fell behind were not encouraged to catch up. They were removed. The march stretched on for weeks. Men died from exposure, disease, exhaustion, and gunfire. The column moved forward regardless. Each step became a decision: stop and die, or move and maybe live. Through it all, he kept walking. The same refusal that had kept him firing as the sky fell now carried him forward across frozen roads. Not hope, not certainty, just the inability to stop. When American forces finally intercepted the column in late April 1945, liberation felt unreal. The guards surrendered. The prisoners stood in silence, too exhausted to react. Freedom arrived quietly, without celebration. He weighed barely over 90 pounds. Medical staff recorded what should not have been possible. A man shot down at 24,000 feet. A bomber cut in half. A fall without a parachute. 17 months of captivity. A forced march through winter. The records called it survival. But survival did not end the story. Survival did not restore what had been taken. It only made the losses permanent. When the war ended, and he was finally processed for return home, the numbers told the story more clearly than any description could. He had entered the army, a healthy young man. He came back weighing barely 90 pounds. Nearly 40% of his body mass was gone, stripped away by injury, infection, starvation, and months of forced movement. His arms never fully recovered. The fractures had healed, but not correctly. Strength was limited. Pain returned with cold weather and strain. The metal plate in his skull remained for the rest of his life, a constant reminder that part of him had been left behind in the wreckage over Germany. Headaches came without warning. Sleep was unreliable. The nights were worse. The sound of tearing metal returned in dreams. The sensation of falling never fully disappeared. The memory of firing into open sky followed him long after the war no longer needed him to fight. When he returned home, people expected gratitude, relief, celebration. They expected stories. He gave them none. For decades, he did not speak about the fall. Not to neighbors, not to friends, not even to his family. Silence became a form of control. Talking about it meant reliving it, and reliving it meant falling again. He worked. He raised a family. He lived quietly, carrying what could not be explained and could not be shared. The world moved forward, and the war became history, something written down rather than endured. Only much later did the details emerge. Military records confirmed what few believed at first. Only 3 Allied airmen in the entire war survived falls of comparable distance without parachutes, all of them saved by fragments of aircraft that altered physics just enough to delay death. His case was among the most extreme. Awards followed. Recognition came. A name placed on a sign. A ceremony held decades too late. None of it changed the moment at 24,000 feet. A bomber had been cut in half. Gravity had taken over. Every rule had said it was over. And yet, the guns had not fallen silent. That was the part that endured. Not the medals, not the survival statistics, not the improbable physics. Just one decision, repeated until there were no seconds left to repeat it. He kept shooting, all the way down. War usually ends with dates. Victory declared, documents signed, guns silenced. But some moments do not recognize endings. Long after the uniforms were folded away and the medals stored in drawers, the moment at 24,000 feet remained exactly where it had always been. It did not fade with time. It did not soften with distance. It existed unchanged, replaying itself whenever memory allowed. A bomber torn in half. A fall that should have lasted seconds. A man who refused to stop acting even when action no longer mattered. History often remembers wars through numbers. Aircraft lost, cities destroyed, casualties counted. But survival like this does not fit neatly into tables or summaries. It resists simplification. It refuses to become a footnote, because it forces a question that history is uncomfortable answering. What happens when every rule fails and a human being keeps going anyway? There was no strategy in that moment. No calculation of odds. No expectation of reward. Only repetition. Grip, fire, breathe. Grip, fire, breathe. Again and again. until there was no sky left to fall through. The Luftwaffe pilots who circled that wreckage never forgot what they saw. Neither did the doctors who chose to operate when it made no sense. Neither did the men who marched beside him through frozen roads months later. Each carried a fragment of the same truth. Survival is not always about escaping death. Sometimes it is about refusing to behave the way death expects. That was the lesson left behind in a falling tail section over Germany. Not heroism. Not defiance. Persistence. A single human action, repeated long after it should have stopped mattering. He kept shooting, all the way down. If this story stayed with you, help keep it alive. Like the video so YouTube shares it with more people who care about real history. Subscribe for more true World War II stories that almost disappeared. And leave a comment telling us where you're watching from.